Okay, that's good. Purpose does the gentleman from New York seek recognition?
Madam Speaker, I move to suspend the rules and pass H-Res 41.
The clerk will report the title of the resolution.
House Resolution 41, resolution rejecting white nationalism and white supremacy.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from New York, Mr. Nadler, and the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Collins, each will control 20 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from New York.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous materials on the measure under consideration.
Without objection.
Thank you. Madam Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Madam Speaker, this resolution stands for one very simple proposition. White nationalism and white supremacy are hateful expressions of intolerance that have no place in the United States of America. Unfortunately, what should be an obvious statement in 2019 has been challenged in recent days, and not for the first time, by one of our own colleagues. As those elected to represent all of America, members of Congress should be the first to condemn white nationalism and white supremacy, which are the source of so much violence, so much hatred, and so much divisiveness throughout our nation's history. These hateful ideologies are diametrically opposed to what America is supposed to be. But as the New York Times reported last week, Mr. King of Iowa was quoted as saying, quote, "White nationalist, white supremacist, Western civilization, how did that language become offensive?" Unquote. Well, I will tell him, and anyone else who may be confused, this language has always been offensive. We fought a civil war to establish that. But this language and the philosophy it represents persisted. It motivated the Ku Klux Klan to terrorize African Americans. It sparked Jim Crow laws that oppressed African Americans through institutionalized racism. It inspired the murder of 9 black congregants in a Charleston, South Carolina church, and the murder of 11 Jewish worshipers in a Pittsburgh synagogue. And it inspired racists, anti-Semites, and other assorted bigots at the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, Virginia, that spread hatred, fear, and ultimately violence in celebration of white supremacy. These hateful ideologies are dangerous, not just because they too often lead to violence. These noxious views can also infect the policies that govern our nation, sowing more division and leading to more injustice in our society. When we establish Muslim bans, when we try to build walls to keep out those who do not look like us, and when we reverse a half-century of progress on voting rights and civil rights, we are putting these hateful views into action. I want to thank the distinguished Majority Whip, the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Clyburn, for bringing this resolution forward. He knows from his experience, both as a leader in the civil rights movement and as a member of Congress whose own constituents were recently targeted in a vicious attack motivated by white supremacy, that when we see bigotry and hatred expressed in any form, we must condemn it loudly and forcefully. We can pretend that these sentiments do not exist in our country, in this Congress, or in the White House. We can try to sweep them under the rug and to convince ourselves that we have moved past our shameful history on race. But we ignore white supremacy at our peril. If we do not speak out now, collectively as a Congress, clearly and without reservation, we will send the message that these views are acceptable, and they will continue to fester in communities across the country, generating more hatred, more repression, and more violence in their wake. I call upon all of my colleagues, Republican and Democrat alike, to reject the hateful ideology of white nationalism and white supremacy, the policies that flow from such hatred, and anyone who would espouse those views. Vote yes on this important resolution. I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Georgia is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. The resolution resolves that the House of Representatives, once again, that we're talking about here, rejects white nationalism and white supremacy as hateful expressions of intolerance that are contradictory to the values that define the people of the United States. And with that, I agree. And as ranking member of the Judiciary Committee, I'd like to use my time to consider with my colleagues how firmly America has stood and continues to stand against white supremacy. It is a basic human flaw that our eyes open to truth too slowly and close on wickedness too quickly. Today, we have the opportunity to renew our gaze at the truth about our fellow men and women, and that each of them is created with untold dignity and worth. As a result, we recognize that white supremacy and white nationalism peddles lies that about our brothers and sisters in dignity. We reject these lies, and we stand on the shoulders of Americans who have gone before us in rejecting white supremacy and racism. As Martin Luther King Jr. observed, when the architects of our republic wrote those magnificent words of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, they were signing a promissory note to which every American was to fall heir. This note was a promise to all men, yes, black men as well as white men, would be guaranteed the unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Dr. King's words are historical fact rooted in universal truth. America's founders gave us an incredible inheritance in the Declaration of Independence, which states that all men are created equal. This declaration helped the founders and all Americans who have lived after them identify that the many ways that we dishonor that equality, recognize and rectify it, and set a more just path forward. In 1807, President Thomas Jefferson, himself a slave owner, publicly supported the abolition of the slave trade, imploring Congress to withdraw the citizens of the United States from all further participation in those violations of human rights which have been so long continuing on the unoffending inhabitants of Africa. George Washington said that there is not a man living who wishes more sincerely than I do to see a plan adopted for the abolition of slavery. John Adams wrote that every measure of prudence therefore ought to be assumed for the eventual total expiration of slavery in the United States, and I have through my whole life held the practice of slavery in abhorrence. Benjamin Franklin believed slavery is an atrocious debasement of human nature. Alexander Hamilton cited racial prejudice as something that makes us fancy many things that are founded neither in reason nor experience. And James Madison wrote that we have seen the mere distinction of color made in the most enlightened period of time a ground for the most oppressive dominion ever exercised by man over man. The words of our founders indict anyone who would believe that white supremacy or actions born out of that worldview is in any way defensible. It does all Americans good to revisit our path out of darkness that feeds racial injustice so that we never find ourselves slipping back, but rather moving forward, knowing that we are all created equal and all are created in God's image. At the beginning of the American Revolution, slavery existed in all 13 original states, and the slave trade with Africa was carried on unconstrained. Official actions to abolish slavery began in 1774, but independence was even declared before it. And this moral movement gained substantial ground over the next 35 years. Delegates to the First Continental Congress in 1774 pledged to stop the importation of slaves into America, and by 1798, every state had outlawed slave importation. During the founding eras, 8 states proceeded to abolish slavery, either gradually or immediately. Were these good steps? Yes. Were they enough? Certainly not. Congress passed the Northwest Ordinance in 1787, forbidding slavery in the territory where the future states of Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, Illinois, and Wisconsin would be established. This law has proved to be decisive in ending slavery in America. In the 1850s, Abraham Lincoln cited the Northwest Ordinance frequently to show that the founders opposed the expansion of slavery. And in the 1860s, these states, along with a number of their fellow states, formed the coalition that elected Lincoln president, won the Civil War, and abolished slavery nationwide. The principle that all men are created equal and have fundamental right to liberty gave the emancipation movement its foundation. And as James Madison wrote in the Federalist Papers, defending the ratification of the Constitution that was grounded on the fundamental principles of the Revolution, namely the transcendent laws of nature and of nature's God, and the rights of humanity announced in the Declaration of Independence. Our first Republican president, Lincoln, understood this well. When Lincoln was a young man, he said the founders established political institutions conducing more essentially to the ends of civil and religious liberty than any of which the history of former times tell us. In the Gettysburg Address, President Lincoln explained that America was conceived in liberty, dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. As Lincoln argued to his opponent, Stephen Douglas, this equality applies to all human beings, regardless of race. When President Lincoln spoke of America's earlier days, he said, "I will remind Mr. Douglas and this audience that while Mr. Jefferson was the owner of slaves, as undoubtedly he was, in speaking upon this very subject, he used the strong language that he trembled for his nation when he remembered that God was just." Mr. Speaker, from my faith background, I will tell you God is just, and I do tremble when I consider his justice. I tremble when any person in any way pretends that white supremacy has an affinity with the Christian faith or its heritage, and frankly am very offended when that is brought up. The Bible is clear on the equality of all people. White people are entitled to no special privilege on this earth, and they will have no unique standing in heaven. In fact, my Bible tells me we will all give account for what we do. Heaven is a place where every person there is united in bowing before God who made us, the God who made us equal. Knowing this, we understand that we should use this life to honor our brothers and sisters without exception. As James tells us, if you really fulfill the royal law according to Scripture, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. You are doing well, but if you show partiality, you are committing sin. Partiality is unacceptable in God's economy, and racial prejudice finds no shelter among American values. Favoritism rooted in racism is evil in all its forms, including white supremacy and white nationalism. Today, Madam Speaker, is a day like many others. Today, like every day, the world is watching America to see if we still believe in equality, if we still elevate human dignity at every turn, if we will reject hypocrisy whenever it tries to take root among us. Today, our fellow citizens are watching to see their leaders live out the American principles alongside them. Today, I stand here with the colleagues to reaffirm these values, reject white supremacy as both dangerous and foolish. Its tenets are as ridiculous as Americans' democracy is remarkable. Today, Madam Speaker, our message is, as it ever was, that every person is created equal in value, and that the hill of equality is one that Americans will stand tall to defend, and yes, even die to defend. We are all, Madam Speaker, created in God's wonderful image. He made us, He breathed life into us. We're the very essence of His beloved creation. There is not a person you will find today, Madam Speaker, no one. I challenge you from the depths of any prison to the sidewalks of any major city, anywhere in this country, white, black, any color imaginable, any race imaginable, any place that they come from, male or female. There is not one person you will find today that when you look into their eyes, they are not deeply beloved by their God who created them. And how can we choose any different? Any ideology that comes in face-to-face confrontation with God's creation is an abomination, and that's exactly what this ideology is. And with that, Madam Speaker, I reserve.
The gentleman from Georgia reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I now yield 4 minutes to the distinguished Majority Whip, Mr. Clyburn.
The gentleman from South Carolina, recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I thank the gentleman for yielding me the time. And I want to say to my colleague, Mr. Collins, that I wish to associate myself with the sentiments that you expressed here today. However, I also rise today to speak of how the tale of two kings has brought us to this moment in history. If he had been allowed to live, the day would have been the 90th birthday of Martin Luther King, Jr. Today, this august body stands ready to vote to disapprove of Representative Steve King's recent comments and condemn the evil concepts of white nationalism and white supremacy. White supremacy and white nationalism are evils. They are insidious and are clear and present dangers to our great republic. Reported hate crimes rose 17% last year, which was the third consecutive year that we've seen an increase in this incidence. This is appalling and unacceptable. When elected representatives give cover and comfort to those who spread racial divisiveness, we embolden those on the fringes of our society. And we have seen some of the results. The massacre of 9 parishioners in historic Charleston's AME Church, Emmanuel AME Church, at the hands of a young man who believed he would be, in his words, rescued by white nationalists after they took over the government, end of quote. The murder of 11 Jewish worshipers at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh by a gunman who believed the Jews were, in his words, waging a propaganda war against Western civilization, the other term used by Mr. King in his comments to the New York Times. And we saw in Charlottesville, Virginia, at the white nationalists United the Right, where they chanted the Nazi phrase, and I quote, blood and soil. Some have questioned the timing of this resolution. Why now? They ask. My guidance, Madam Speaker, comes from Dr. King, who wrote in his letter from the Birmingham jail, time itself is neutral. It can be used either destructively or constructively. More and more I feel, continued Dr. King, that the people of ill will have used time much more effectively than have the people of goodwill. And then he closed his thought with these words: we must use time creatively in the knowledge that the time is always ripe to do right. Now is the time to do right. We have reached a tipping point. Racial divisiveness is a fault line that is ripping our nation apart. This body must speak out against this evil. The time has come to condemn those of ill will and say that no part in our great nation can be had by them. May I have one more minute?
Does the gentleman want another minute?
Yes.
I yield the gentleman 1 more minute.
Thank you. When the French historian Alexis de Tocqueville visited this country, he observed its greatness and set out to find the genius that made it so. He wrote in his book, Democracy in America, that, and I quote, the greatness of America lies not in being more enlightened than any other nation, but rather in her ability to repair her faults. White supremacy and white nationalism are faults that cannot be repaired but must be removed. White supremacy and white nationalism should be condemned by this body, and I call upon my colleagues to join me in doing so. I yield back.
The gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Georgia is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. At this time, I yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from Iowa, Mr. King.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I thank the gentleman from Georgia for yielding me time to address this issue. I understand and recognize the gravity of this issue that's before us. I can hear it in the voice of the gentleman from Georgia. I can hear it from Mr. Clyburn. I can hear it from Mr. Nadler. And I know all of you. And I think I know all of you well. I thought you all knew me well. But I began to read this resolution, Madam Speaker, and I started with the first whereas, and I'm going to read it as it's here. Whereas on January 10th, 2019, Representative Steve King was quoted as asking, quote, white nationalists, white supremacists, Western civilization, there's a dash in there, a pause. How did that language become offensive, close quote. I understand how you interpreted my words when you read them this way. There is no tape for this interview that I did. It was 56 minutes long. There are some notes on the other end, but there is no tape. There's no way to go back and listen. But I can tell you this, that ideology never shows up in my head. I don't know how it could possibly come out of my mouth. So I'm going to tell you that the words are likely what I said, but I want to read it to you the way I believe I said it. And that's this: white nationalist, white supremacist, Western civilization. How did that language become offensive? Why did I sit in classes teaching me about the merits of our history and civilization? That's the end of the quote. Just to watch Western civilization become a derogatory term in political discourse today. That's what I believe happened. And it's 13 words, ironically, that's caused this firestorm. And again, I regret that we are in this place. I read all the rest of the resolutions that are here. Number 2, I reject the ideology. The statement's true, Mr. Clyburn. Number 3, same story. I reject the ideology that's noted in here, but your statement's true. As I read these so far down, number 4, number 5, all the way through all these resolutions, that are all the whereases that are here in this resolution, I agree with all of them. I agree with every word that you're putting in this. It's an honest and a direct resolution put together to address a subject that has been too long before the public dialogue in this country. And when I look down at the resolve, that's usually the meat of these. It says resolved that the House of Representatives once again rejects white nationalism and white supremacy as hateful expressions of intolerance that are contradictory to the values that define the people of the United States. Well, I agree with that. Just a couple of weeks ago, I stood on this floor with the Bible in my hand, and I took an oath to support and defend the Constitution of the United States. That Bible wasn't just a regular Bible picked up somewhere. That was the shirt pocket-sized leather Bible that my great-uncle John Richardson carried in his shirt pocket for 3 years in the Civil War. I come from a family of abolitionists. Maybe I would have some artifacts from his cousin, my 5 times great-grandfather, if he hadn't been killed in that conflict. This means something to me. The abolitionism that goes clear back into my family, and they paid a price with their lives to make sure that all men and now all women are created equal and were endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights. And those rights are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And I absolutely believe in that. It is in my heart and my soul, and it's in my works. By their fruits you shall know them. But the New York Times has a different version of this. They make a habit of attacking the president, as a matter of fact. And I look at this language that's here, this resolution, that the House of Representatives once again rejects white nationalism and white supremacy and hateful expressions of intolerance that are contradictory to the values that define the people of the United States. I agree with that language I've said. But I would add to it the language that I used on this floor in this very place last Friday afternoon when I said I would strengthen it by adding my previous statements, which not only correctly rejects white nationalism and white supremacy as evil ideologies, but also condemn anyone that supports this evil and bigoted ideology that saw in its ultimate expression the systematic murder of 6 million innocent Jewish lives. That's where I stand. That's what I believe. So I want to compliment the gentleman from South Carolina for bringing this resolution. And I've carefully studied every word in this resolution. And even though I'd add some more that are stronger language, I agree with the language in it. So I want to ask my colleagues on both sides of the aisle, let's vote for this resolution. I'm putting up a yes on the board here because what you say here is right and it's true and it's just. And so is what I have stated here on the floor of the House of Representatives. Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Georgia reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Madam Speaker, how much time do I have left?
The gentleman has 11 and a half minutes. 11 and a half minutes.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I now yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentlelady from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee.
I thank the gentleman. I beg to differ from my good friend from Iowa. I do believe that we all are created equal within certain inalienable rights. But what I would say to him is that Western civilization is what we all are. There is no denigrating of Western civilization. It is what America is. We're the greatest leader of Western civilization. We're the greatest leader of the free world. But what we are speaking about is, of course, the words white nationalism and white supremacy. For it is clear that the FBI makes a direct point between dehumanizing and derogatory comments which come from white nationalists and white supremacists to the idea that it generates, as you have heard here on the floor of the House, it generates the death of Dr. Martin Luther King. It generates Charlottesville. It generates Charleston, South Carolina. It generates hateful acts that result in death. This is the kind of intolerance or the tolerating this that we cannot suffer, and the intolerance that we cannot suffer. Because the idea of white nationalism as superior to others and white supremacy indicates that somebody else might die. This resolution is an important resolution to affirm this Congress and this nation that we believe that we all are created equal, and as Dr. King said, that we shall overcome, and someday we shall overcome. I yield back.
The gentleman from Georgia is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. At this time, I am pleased to yield 2 minutes to the gentlelady from West Virginia, gentlelady Carol Merrill.
Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Ladies recognized.
I rise today to speak out against white supremacy. As a Christian, I live my life by the guidance and teaching of Jesus Christ and by the many great lessons in the Bible. Matthew 7:12 tells us, "So whatever you wish that others would do to you, do also to them." This is the golden rule, that we treat every person as we wish to be treated. This is why I stand here today to say that there is no place for white supremacy, anti-Semitism, racism, or bigotry of any kind in Congress. Thank you, and I yield back my time to the gentleman from Georgia.
Gentleman from Georgia reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I now yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentleman from Tennessee, a member of the Judiciary Committee, Mr. Cohen.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Nadler. I want to thank Mr. Clyburn for bringing this resolution, and I want to thank the Republican leadership, Mr. McCarthy and company, who have condemned white supremacist, white nationalist language. It's important that we come together and condemn this language because, unfortunately, at Charlottesville, Virginia, we had Ku Klux Klan's people and neo-Nazis marching and saying, "Jews will not replace us in blood and soil." And our president said there were fine people on both sides. We must condemn bigotry and racial superiority and hate whenever it raises its ugly head so that it will not come back to bite us once again. So today, hopefully in the House, we have done that. And I commend my Republican colleagues and Mr. Collins, and I hope that when hatred and bigotry once again surfaces, raises its head, which it will, that we will stand together as Americans to condemn it and not see fine people on both sides. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Georgia is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. At this point in time, I recognize the gentleman from Utah, Mr. Stewart, for 3 minutes.
I'd like to thank the Chairman and thank the Speaker. I rise in support of this resolution, which again rejects white nationalism, white supremacy as hateful expressions of intolerance that are contradictory to our values that define the people of the United States. And I call on my colleagues, both Republicans and Democrats, to denounce racial and religious bigotry in all shapes. And like many, I do have some personal insight into this problem. It doesn't come as a surprise to many that being from Utah, I am a Mormon, and my church, as many know, was founded in New York in the early 1800s, and we were driven further and further west as members of my church were targeted and harassed and killed for their sincerely held religious beliefs, culminating in the murder of our founder and subsequent decision to relocate to Utah. My own ancestors were targeted in this bigotry. They lost their possessions, they lost their lands, they lost their freedom. In some cases, they lost their lives. Unfortunately, such hatred still exists today. 3 years ago, we witnessed a tragedy in Charleston, where a deranged individual motivated by white supremacy shot and killed 9 black worshipers and injured many others. We remember the riots in Charlottesville, where a white nationalist struck and killed a white woman who was protesting, once again, white supremacy. But the problem is more widespread than just these individuals who advocate for white supremacy. We also need to condemn anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism, and those who enable it. Last October, a perpetrator shot and killed 11 Jewish worshipers at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, which we all remember. All of these should be condemned by all of us here in this body, black, white, rich or poor, Muslim, Christian, Jewish. We are all, I believe, children of the same God. And I hope that the majority, and they're sincere in ushering in this resolution to the floor, not just as an opportunity to shame one party as irredeemably racist, but as a united statement against bigotry. When bigotry goes unchallenged, it festers and rears its ugly heads in ways that test our nation's greatest triumphs in shedding these shameful practices of slavery and other types of racial and religious intolerance. This is something that must unite this body. I hope that it does. I believe that it will. And with that, Madam Speaker, I yield back.
The gentleman from Georgia reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I now yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentleman from Rhode Island, Mr. Cicilline.
Gentleman is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I rise today in support of Mr. Clyburn's resolution condemning white supremacy and white nationalism. Congressman Steve Key's recent comments asserting that terms like white supremacist should be acceptable have rightly drawn strong condemnation from both sides of the aisle in this chamber. Sadly, these comments are part of a well-documented history of embracing the far right and making racist, anti-immigrant remarks for more than a decade. And all of us know more and more people are feeling emboldened today to publicly voice bigoted and evil views like these. We've seen it in the discussions around Charlottesville, the current debate on immigration, and in criticism of football players silently and peacefully protesting police brutality. These views are contrary to our country's founding values of fairness and equality. America was founded on the simple but powerful idea that all are created equal and worthy of dignity and respect. White nationalism and white supremacy are a vile assault on that magnificent ideal. These views belong on the ash heap of history. That is exactly where this resolution will put them. I urge my colleagues to vote yes, and I yield back.
The gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Georgia is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. At this time, it's my pleasure to yield 2 minutes to one of our new freshmen from Pennsylvania, Guy Reschenthaler.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise today in support of House Resolution 41, a resolution rejecting white nationalism and white supremacy. As a lifelong resident of southwestern Pennsylvania, I was devastated by the shooting that killed 11 Jewish worshipers and wounded 6 others at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania on October 27, 2018. This despicable act of domestic terrorism reminded us that evil is alive in this world and must be confronted in a spirit of courage. The day after this cowardly act of violence, I stood in solidarity with Americans of all religions, all races, all ethnicities at a vigil honoring the victims of this heinous crime. There is no place for this kind of thinking in our country. When the rights of any community are under attack, all of our rights are under attack. We must come together as a nation to stand up against hatred, white nationalism, and bigotry in our country. I commend the leadership of my party for their strong response to any comments that divide our country. And I thank my colleague from South Carolina for introducing this important resolution and yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Georgia reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I now yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Demings.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Madam Speaker, it is surely a shame that it is necessary in the year of 2019 for the U.S. Congress to denounce white nationalism in Congress. As a police officer, I worked white supremacist rallies. The words alone hurt enough. But as a police officer, I also saw vicious acts of violence by those inspired by those hateful words. Words do have consequences. And if you promote hateful, ignorant beliefs, you will be held accountable. And certainly Congress should lead the way. This week, the ignorance of white nationalism was defended by one of my colleagues. Today, as we recognize Dr. King's birthday, I am reminded that Dr. King called on all Americans to enlist in a crusade finally to end the race question and make it an ugly relic of a dark past. But still, we know hate crimes are on the rise. We understand why. Madam Speaker, if we are who we say we are, a great nation, one nation, with liberty and justice for all, then we all must exercise our power and take a stand so strong that even the white supremacists cannot ignore. Thank you, and I yield back.
The gentleman from New York
I'll continue to reserve.
reserves, and the gentleman from Georgia.
I'll continue to reserve, Madam Speaker.
Gentleman from Georgia reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentlelady from Washington, Ms. Jayapal.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and thank you, Mr. Chairman. It has been an open secret for too long that Representative Steve King of Iowa has made a trade in saying and pushing fundamentally racist and unacceptable ideas. And while I'm glad that my colleagues on the other side are speaking out and have taken this important act of stripping Mr. King of his committees, let us be very clear that those of us who have served with Mr. King on the Judiciary Committee, those of us who are African American, Latino, immigrant, those of us who are Caucasian and steeped in our histories, in our country's history of slavery and racism, we all know that the record of these kinds of comments is long. In 2013, Mr. King said that for every dreamer who is a valedictorian, there are another 100 undocumented immigrants who have calves the size of cantaloupes because they are hauling 75 pounds of drugs across the border. In 2017, he said we couldn't restore civilization with, quote, somebody else's babies. Madam Speaker, how dare he? I was born in India. I am somebody else's baby, and I am a proud American. And just last year, Mr. King met with members of a Nazi-linked party in Austria. A member of Congress continuously making these comments that cause the deepest of harm to real people, physical harm in the form of hate crimes and psychological harm. I have 30 seconds extra.
I'll yield the gentlelady an additional 30 seconds.
Gentlelady.
Thank you. Madam Speaker, all of us, whether African American, people of color, immigrants, we are not other categories of people. We are not somebody else. We are America, all of us. And the terrible truth is that racism and xenophobia escalates when racism and white supremacy are permitted here in Congress and all the way up to the White House to be issues with both sides. There are no both sides when it comes to white supremacy. And so, Madam Speaker, I hope that this is just the start of a definitive party-wide turn away from racism for all of us on both sides. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I yield back.
Gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Georgia is recognized. The gentleman from Georgia reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Speaker, how much time do I have left?
And has 6 minutes.
6 minutes. Madam Speaker, I now yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentleman from California, Mr. Swalwell.
Thank you, Mr.
The gentleman from California is recognized.
I rise to reject white nationalism, to reject white supremacy, and to reject anyone who supports these immoral ideas. I reject Steve King. So does America. And you know what? So do the people of Iowa's 4th Congressional District. How do I know that? Because I was born there. To a police officer as a father and a mom who raised 4 boys. And the way that they raised us is the way that every family in cities like Ames and Algona and Sac City raised their kids. To love each other, to love God, to work together, and to believe that in a community we come together and that love always conquers. They reject the bigotry that they hear day after day from their representative. And I want to make sure that every person in the United States knows that what was expressed by our colleague is an exception and does not define the hardworking people of Western Iowa. And I yield back.
Gentleman from New York reserves. Gentleman from
Madam Speaker, could I inquire of the time left in the debate?
The gentleman from Georgia has 3 minutes. And the gentleman from New York has 5 minutes.
I will continue to reserve. Thank you.
Gentleman from Georgia reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I now yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentlelady from California, Ms. Lee.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Madam Speaker, and thank you, Chairman Nadler, for yielding. I also want to thank Majority Whip Clyburn for his leadership in putting this resolution together. I rise in strong support of this resolution, which sends a clear message that we will not accept hate or bigotry within this House. Let me be clear. While Congressman King's comments condoning white supremacy were abhorrent, they were not a surprise to many of us. In years past, Congressman King has implied the dreamers are drug dealers. He's endorsed far-right, authoritarian, and neo-Nazi sympathizers. And he's repeatedly reiterated the belief that multicultural communities are a threat to our societies. These racist beliefs, they should not be espoused by anyone, let alone a United States congressman. I grew up in the Jim Crow South, Madam Speaker. I know that racism and discrimination don't just cause pain. When these beliefs become policies, which Congressman King votes on and writes, they institutionalize a vicious system that people of color have to deal with
time has expired.
As it relates to being denied equal rights and equal respect. These are the consequences of white supremacy. May I have 30 seconds?
I'll yield 30 seconds to the gentlelady.
Gentlelady.
These, as I said, are the consequences of white supremacy. So I ask my colleagues in both parties to vote today on what would have been Dr. King's 90th birthday to condemn white nationalism and white supremacy. I urge a yes on this resolution, yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Georgia
I continue to reserve.
Gentleman from Georgia reserves. The gentleman from New York is
Madam
recognized.
Speaker, I now yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentlelady from California, Ms. Chu.
Gentlelady is recognized.
As chair of the Congressional Asian Pacific American Caucus, I rise to reject white nationalism and white supremacy. These philosophies divide us, teach fear, and lead to violence. They are to blame for the worst of American history, from slavery and Jim Crow to the fatal shooting of Sikhs at an Oak Creek Gurdwara and Jews at the Tree of Life Synagogue. White nationalism led to the passage of the Chinese Exclusion Act, forcing Chinese immigrants like my grandfather to be condemned to life as a second-class citizen. But today, his granddaughter stands here as the first Chinese-American woman in Congress, and I am not alone. This is the most diverse and representative Congress in our history. The message is clear. Diversity has a place in Congress. Prejudice does not. But white nationalism is finding a home in politics once again through racist rhetoric and xenophobic misinformation aimed at immigrants and others. Any attempt by politicians at any level to encourage fear of those who look different must be rejected. I urge support for this resolution.
The gentleman from New York yields, reserves. The gentleman from Georgia.
Madam Speaker, I reserve.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I now yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Cunningham.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Chairman Nadler. Madam Speaker, I rise to support House Resolution 41, rejecting white nationalism and white supremacy. Today, on what would have been Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s 90th birthday, I am honored to join Majority Whip Clyburn in denouncing the racist remarks of Representative Steve King and condemning white supremacy and white nationalism in all forms. Hatred and bigotry should have no home in America, and certainly not one in the halls of Congress. Dr. King was one of the finest citizens this country has produced, a champion for justice and a fearless crusader for equality. Today and every day, we must honor the life and legacy of Dr. King while also acknowledging the work which remains. We must strongly condemn hateful expressions of intolerance wherever and whenever we see them. America is strongest when we stand together.
Gentleman's time
From the
has
low
ex-
country
has
to the
expired.
heartland, I believe that today is a promising start. I yield back my time. Thank you.
Gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Georgia.
I continue to reserve.
The gentleman from Georgia reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I now yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Ryan.
Gentleman's recognized.
I thank the gentleman from New York. I rise in support of this resolution, but I also believe that the House of Representatives should go one step further, and I believe we should institute a censure for Mr. King to signal to this country and to our children that this behavior is unacceptable. And the underlying premise is that we've had leaders at the highest levels down the street from here condone and continue to perpetuate race baiting, white supremacist language that is not good for this country. We need to come together. We are a weaker country today because we are so divided. And what this is all about is whether the United States is going to move forward saying that we are a united country, that we respect diversity, and not only respect it, but recognize that our diversity in this country is our greatest strength. It's our greatest cultural strength, and it's our greatest economic strength. And this House needs to take this resolution one step further. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Georgia
Reserve.
reserves. The gentleman from New York, you're recognized.
Madam Speaker, I ask that the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Allred, be recognized for a unanimous consent request.
The gentleman is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I rise to ask for unanimous consent to support the resolution against white nationalism and against white supremacy.
Without objection. Gentleman from New York.
No, does the gentleman? We have no further. I have one further speaker who will close. So.
Okay. Then if the gentleman's prepared to close, I'm ready.
The gentleman from New York
We're prepared to
reserves.
close.
The gentleman from Georgia is recognized.
And the time we have left, Madam Speaker.
The gentleman has 3 minutes.
3 minutes still. Thank you. Madam Speaker, we have heard from many here today, and I think we all have come to a common theme. And the common theme is that everybody that we meet, it goes back to the simple rule that most of us would have learned growing up, and we've heard it referenced here today, but maybe as simple as in kindergarten, you hold hands, you look after each other, you treat people with respect no matter where they come from, what they look like, what the color of their skin is, what their gender may be, or what religion they may practice. What is true on the floor today and what should be true in the hearts of every American, and frankly, not just every American, but those around the world, is that we realize that we have been given a gift by God, that we have been given the strength by God, and we've been given the hope by God to treat each other with dignity, respect, and love. When we understand that, then it takes away. But we also, Madam Speaker, today have also realized that when we as members speak, people pay attention and people hold us accountable. And we've talked about that in many ways, and that cannot continue in the way that we have seen it. White supremacy is wrong. White nationalism is wrong. Anti-Semitism is wrong. When we divide ourselves and we classify ourselves against each other, we bring ourselves down, not those that we go after. And as long as we ever have anyone in this country that believes that they can climb to the top on the backs of others because they make fun of their race, their gender, their ethnicity, or any other thing, then we value and devalue the very breath that God gives us. Madam Speaker, as I said earlier when I opened this up, there is not anyone we face today, anyone we come in contact with today, that is not inherently and deeply loved by God. And it's pretty simple. He breathed life into them. I believe it with all that I am here. And if I cannot believe that if I believe that God created each and every person that I see and everything we see around us, how can I not value that creation? How can I not stand against anyone who would tear that down? Or especially if there was ever a thought in this country from anybody anywhere to take and say this is a Christian value, then I judge them to say there will be a judgment. It is already written down that no man stands that way. So today it's pretty simple. Place a yes vote on the floor. We support this resolution because it's not an American value. It's not what we stand for. And that, Madam Speaker, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I now yield to close the debate on our side the remainder of our time to the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Krishnamurti.
The gentleman from Illinois is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise on Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday to urge passage of H.Res. 41 and to reject white nationalism and white supremacy in all its forms. And I applaud both sides for taking up this resolution in support of rejecting white nationalism. But today, Madam Speaker, I ask one question. Where does President Trump stand on this resolution? Will President Trump do as we are doing and reject white supremacy in all its forms? So far, we have heard nothing but silence. I ask him to act and do the same, rejecting white supremacy and white nationalism today. Thank you.
The gentleman yields back. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and agree to House Resolution 41? Those in favor, say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, 2/3 being in the affirmative, the rules are suspended. The resolution is agreed to and without objection.
Madam Speaker.
Purpose as the gentleman.
Madam Speaker, on that I ask the yeas and nays.
Nays are requested. All those in favor of taking this vote by the yeas and the nays will rise and remain standing until counted. A sufficient number having risen, the yeas and nays are ordered. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, further proceedings on this question will be postponed.